Hey, so in this video, I'm going to attempt to teach you advanced prototyping in ProtoPie in about 20 minutes. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to take a single component, so we're going to use the Android switch component, and I'm going to take it through all the steps, all the way through learning how to use triggers and responses, learning how to use conditions, variables, turning it into a component, adding component overrides so you can change certain values, and passing messages out so you can change other parts of your user interface based on the state of that switch component. It's going to be a lot, but it's going to cover all the key areas that you need to know to learn how to prototype at an advanced level in ProtoPie. So you should be able to take all of these concepts that you learn and expand on them and build a whole plethora of components. You could effectively, from this, build a whole design system, an interactive design system in ProtoPie for your projects. Okay, so wish me luck, and without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so in this first section, we're going to learn the basics of ProtoPie's triggers and responses. So these are the two things that you use to create interactivity. Okay, so let's just go through the layer structure. So we've got a label layer, which has just got this show password text in it. And then we've got this switch container layer. And inside of that, it's got a track layer and it's got a handle layer. Okay, so really, really simple. So our first job is to make the switch into its selected state. So this is based on the Material Design 3 switch. So jobs to be done, I want to be able to select the switch, and when I select the switch, the handle is going to move to the right, it's going to increase in size, and it's going to change color. The background of the track is going to change color, and the border is going to change color as well. So let's get started and create this interaction. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select the switch layer in my layers panel here. I'm going to come over to the triggers panel. So this is the panel where you add all your triggers and responses, or all your interactivity. And I'm going to choose a tap trigger. Okay, you can see here in the target that it's selected the switch. That's because I pre-selected it. Okay, so this is my first trigger. So within this, I want to start adding these responses. Okay, so the first response I'm going to add is a scale response. And remember, I want to scale the handle. So I'm going to choose the handle. And I want to scale this to 24 pixels on the width and 24 pixels on the height. Okay, so that's my first response done. My next response I want to add is a move response. And again, this is going to be moving the handle. And this is going to be moving it to 36 pixels. Okay, so that's the place on the right-hand side where I want it to move to. Okay. And the next thing I want to add is a color response. Okay, so I'm going to add a color response here. So we're going to change the color of the handle, and I'm going to want to change it to white. So I'm just going to choose a white color here. And then I want to add another color response. So I can actually duplicate responses. I don't have to keep adding them from the list here if I don't want to. So I'm going to duplicate this color response. I'm going to change the target to the track. And I'm going to change the track color just based on the kind of standard material design file you get from Figma to this particular hex value 6750A4, which is like a purple color. Okay. Okay. So that should be all I need to do. So I'm scaling. So when I'm tapping, let's kind of go through. When I'm tapping, I'm scaling the handle. I'm moving the handle. I'm changing the color of the handle. And I'm changing the color of the track. Oh, well, the final thing I need to do is actually to change the border. And when we change colors, we can also change the colors of certain things all in the same response here. Okay, so I'm actually going to check the border response here. I'm actually going to just make it the same purple because that's what they do in material. There we go. Okay, so to test my progress, I've got a preview window. I've got a floating preview window. So I can just hit preview. I'm just going to bring that over to the left-hand side. And I'm actually going to come into this cog And you just want to make sure, if you want to have it on screen all the time, just make sure we've got this always on top selected. Okay, so even when I'm working, it's going to stay selected. Okay, so let's try this out. So I'm just going to tap it. And there you go. We see we've got our first animation created. Something else I want to show you how to do is how to change the animation curves. Okay, so here we've got, I'm just going to reset this. So down in the bottom left-hand corner, we've got this little reset button. So you can see I've got an animation on there. I can actually change the easing curves with that. So let's come back into I'm going to change the scale and the move, and I can actually select these two together. So I'm going to change the easing curve to the same curve. So I'm going to come into easing. So I'm going to tap on the little icon. And I'm actually going to change this to an ease out. Okay, so I'm going to select ease out here. And I'm just going to just have cubic selected, so the default one. And I'm going to click OK. And if I come back to my response now, I can see that it's just a bit faster. I'm going to do this on the color actually as well. So let's just come into color. And we're going to change that to ease out. And we'll do that to the other one as well. So they're all the same. Okay, so there you go. We've now got our first animation created, and you've now just learned how to use triggers and responses inside of ProtoPie. Okay, so in this section, we're going to look at how you can use conditions to create the different states of the switch component. So we've created the first part of the animation, which is turning the switch on, but we've got no way of turning it off because we're effectively using the same tap trigger to instigate both states, because effectively, obviously, the switch component is a toggle. And this is where conditions come in. So let's add conditions and create both states. So we're going to come over to our tap trigger. And if we hit the plus button at the bottom here, we're going to add a condition. And within this condition, we're going to first target the element we want to use to drive the condition. And effectively what we're going to do is we're going to look at the position of the handle. And because we know that when the handle's on the right hand side, so when it's in that 24 pixel state, we know it's on. And when it's in its left hand state, which is 16 pixels, we know it's off. So we're going to use the position, so the X position, to drive this condition. Okay, so we're going to choose the handle layer, and we're going to leave the X property, which just happens to be the default property. And here we've got a bunch of equality operators. Okay, they sound scary, but they're not really. By default, we've just got the equals, and that's really what we want to use in this case. We want to see when the handle's X position equals a certain value. And if we come back to, actually, if we come into our file and look at its default position, we can see that it's currently at an X position of 16. So we're going to use that. So we're going to type 16 in here. Okay. So now we want to take all of our responses that we've already added, and we want to put them inside the condition. So we only want them to run when that condition is true. So we're going to select them all and drag them and just drop them into the condition. Okay. And we're also going to rename this condition so we can keep track of what each thing does. So we're going to call this select. Okay. So now we've got all of our responses in this condition. So when we tap it, this is effectively going to select the switch. Okay. Okay, so now we need to do the other toggle state. Okay, so we want to be able to unselect the switch. So really easy way to do that is we're going to duplicate this first condition, and that's going to duplicate the condition, everything inside of it. And we just need to tweak the condition slightly. So we know in the first condition, the selected condition, we were looking to see if the X position of the handle was 16. So we know from that it's in its off state. In this one, we want to know what its on state is. So we know what it's going to be because our move response is moving it to 36. Okay. So let's come into our second condition and we'll change the value to 36. So if the handle's X position equals 36, we know it's on and we want to switch it off. Now, we could go into all of these responses and kind of reverse them, but there's a really quick and easy way to do this without changing every single value. So I'm going to delete all of these responses out. I'm going to add a new response called reset. Okay, and we're going to reset each layer to its original state when the prototype loaded, which effectively will be its unselected state. So the first thing we're going to reset is the track. And again, we can duplicate this response. And the second thing we're going to reset is the handle. Okay, so they're the two layers that are changing. And that's all we need to do. Okay, so let's come over to preview and try that out. So I'm going to tap it once. That's going to select it. And if I tap it again, it's going to unselect it. Okay, so you now know how to use conditions. So obviously you can see there's lots of different types of conditions you can create. So have a good play with them. But fundamentally, this is how all conditions work. So if you don't know what a variable is, I like to explain it as a container for a value. So if you imagine you had a cardboard box, that's kind of the variable, and whatever you put inside the box, that's the value. And there are three types of boxes ProtoPie has, so three types of variables. There's a number variable, there's a text variable, and there's a hex color variable. And in this part, we're just going to use the number variable, and we're going to use it to control the state of our switch component. So we're going to say that when the switch is in its off state, it's going to have a value of 0. And when it's in its on state, it's going to have a value of 1. So we're going to use 1 and 0 to represent off and on. Okay, so let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come down to the variables panel. And there's two kinds of variables. Don't worry about the for all scenes variable. We're just going to use this for this scene variable, okay? It's going to add that. And by default, it's going to be a number variable, which is exactly what we want. I'm just going to rename this. I'm going to call it state. Okay. And I'm going to come back to my first condition. So instead of using the X position to drive the condition, I'm going to use the variable value instead. So instead of using the handle layer, I'm going to pull down the drop down. I'm going to choose our newly created state variable. And now I just need to tweak the condition slightly. So effectively we're saying, well, if the state variable equals 0, because we know 0 is going to be the off state, we want to turn it on. So remember, we're doing the select state here. Okay. Now I need to add an extra response here, because once we go from off to on, we need to change our variable from 0 to 1. Remember that 1's going to represent on. So I'm going to come into our first condition, add an assign response. The assign response is the response you use for changing values in variables. I'm going to select my variable. And I'm going to change its value to 1. Okay. Now I need to do the reverse. So I come into my second condition. I'm going to choose my variable again. So I'm going to choose my state variable. And this time I want this to trigger when the variable value is 1. Remember, 1 is on. So if it's on, we want to turn it off. Okay, so that's going to run. It's going to run these two resets. And again, we need to assign the new value to the variable. So I can use my copy and paste functionality and kind of copy this assign response from the first condition. And I'm going to paste it into the second condition. And I want to change the value that it writes to the variable to be 0. Okay, so let's come over to our preview window and see if that's worked. Effectively, nothing should change. We're just using a different way of controlling the on and off state. So if we tap it, it's on. And if we tap it again, it's off. And you might be wondering why you would use variables instead of the way we did it before. So what I'd say to you is, what if you changed the size of the switch? Maybe you made it a bit longer. Maybe you effectively changed the X position of the handle inside. If you did that, every time you did that, you'd have to update your responses, your move response, because it's being triggered on that X value. When you use variables, you effectively allow yourself to make any changes to your switch component, because all it's really using is the variable value instead. Okay, so let's turn this switch component into a real component. So we're going to come over to our scene here. We're just going to select the switch container, and we're going to basically hit this lightning bolt button, which says component underneath. And there you go. It's now a component. Now, because we've used variables, you can see that this state variable is still sitting outside the component. It didn't drag that into the component. We actually want it inside the component. Okay, so we're going to select the state variable. We're going to do a copy. So Command C on Mac, Control C on Windows. And we're going to come into the component library. So that's this little button here. And you can see there it is, our switch component. So we want to get into the internals of that component because we can make changes inside of it. So we're just going to double click that. And now we're inside the component, okay? So we're just going to do a Command V, so an Apple paste, to paste our variable back in. You may have seen that just before we did that, there was some orange over here. Orange means there's some missing values or an error. So that's now all been fixed because it was just basically missing that variable. And that's all we need to do to turn our switch element into a switch component. So we can now step back out of this component, back to the scene. And we've now got this component. You can see that it's got this teal color now and it's lightning bolt icon. So this means it's a proper component, and I can now drag lots of them out. And I've got all these switch components. Okay, so let's see how we can add component overrides to our newly created switch component. So we're going to open up the switch component from the component library. So now we're in component mode, and we can see we've got all our triggers and responses here. So they're all internalized inside the component. And what we're going to do, we're going to add a component variable. So we're going to add another variable. And this time we're going to use a color variable. Okay. So we're going to call this selected color. Selected underscore color. You can name it however you want, but I find if you put a underscore between the words, it makes it a bit more human readable, and you'll see what I mean when we come out of the component. Okay, so we've got our variable called selected color. We want to set the default color to that purple color, and that's going to be 6750A4. That's our purple color. Okay, and the other thing we want to do is we want to make it overridable. So this is like the most important thing. So checking this make overridable box is now going to make it available outside of our component. Okay, so we now need to hook up the color to our responses inside. So if you remember, we use these color responses, this particular one here, which is driving the purple color. So we want to take the hard value out now. We want to attach it to this newly created variable that we've created in our variables panel. So we're going to select into our field, and you'll see there's this FX button kind of on the right hand side, and that's basically allowing us to get into something into ProtoPie called formulas. Okay, so I'm going to click that. I'm going to actually remove this hard value. I'm going to hit this plus button, and I'm going to choose our selected color and variable and click OK. So now it's going to get its color from this variable, and by default it's the purple color. Okay, we want to change the border as well, so we need to do exactly the same thing with the border. Remove the value and just attach it to that selected color variable. Okay, and if we step back out, if we now select our switch in the layers panel and we come over to the properties panel, you can see now we've got this override that we've got control of. So if I now just select this, and maybe I want to change to another color, I can come in here and maybe I can change this green color. And I can now see that it's driving, the on state is now becoming green. And I can change this to any color I want. Okay, and you can effectively override anything you want that you can possibly imagine inside of your components and allow access for people using your components just to kind of change these values. Okay, so components are great. You know, we've got this component like switches on and switches off. And that's very nice, but it doesn't actually control anything, and we can't really use it to control anything else in our prototype. We need a way of talking to it and for it to talk back to us. And in ProtoPie, the way we do that is by using something called messages. So we're going to use some messages in our switch component, and it's effectively going to tell us when it's in its off state and when it's in its on state. And we're going to use that to change the text in this label. Okay, so let's get to it. So we're going to come over to our main component, and we're going to open it up, and we're going to come to the first condition. And in this first condition, we're going to add something called a send response. Okay, so in ProtoPie we have messages, and there's two parts of messages. There's the send response and the receive trigger. Okay, so we're going to send a message out of the component that we can capture outside of it. And the message we're going to send it to the current scene, so back to our main scene, and we're going to send the message on. Simple as that. Okay, so when we select the switch and it's in the on state, we're going to send this on message. And conversely, when it's in its off state, we want to send the message off. Okay, so that's all we need to do inside of our component. So we're going to come back out of it. So now we need to receive that message and do something with it. So inside of our triggers panel in our scene, we're going to add a receive trigger. And first off, we're going to receive the on message. And when we receive that on message, we're going to use this text response. And we're going to select our label layer and we're going to change the text. So we're going to change the text to hide password because this is a toggle. Okay, hide password. So that's going to do one side of it. We now can duplicate this receive trigger. We're going to change the message to off. And we're going to change the text back to show password. Okay. So that's all we need to do. So let's give that a test. So when I toggle my switch on, it turns on and it uses that message system to send a message out, which we're capturing and using that to change the text. And then if I switch it off, it's then turning that text back to what it originally said. Okay, that's it. You now know how to use messages. Okay, so let's just review. In about 20 minutes, you've learned how to use triggers and responses to create animations. You've learned how to use easing curves. What else? You've learned how to use conditions to do conditional logic, and we use that to control our toggles. You actually saw two different ways of using conditions, using properties, and also when we got to our third thing, variables, we use variables to control the state. So that was conditions and variables working together, which typically you tend to use them a lot together. After that, we turned our switch component into a ProtoPie component. And then inside of that, we started to give access to certain features using component overrides. So specifically, we allow people to override the color, but you could override a whole bunch of stuff. And then finally, we then made that component useful by hooking up messages and sending out the state, broadcasting the state of the component to our main prototype, where we could use that to kind of change that text label based on the state of the component. Okay, so that's a wrap on advanced prototyping in ProtoPie in about 20 minutes. You can use these principles to create lots and lots of components. You can effectively create a whole design system with it. I did, and if you're interested in a fully ready-made mobile design system, all made in ProtoPie, you can check out my Skeleton UI component kit, and I'll put a link in the description. That's got a whole bunch of components available to you, and some really advanced ones. And what's good about them is that you can get into them, you can see how I built them. I've tried my best to kind of make it really human readable, so you can basically reverse engineer them. And there's also a whole bunch of documentation showing you how to use them as well. Okay, so hope you've enjoyed this video. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a like and please subscribe. That'd be really great. It's great for you because you get to hear when I release new videos, and it's great for me because it helps the YouTube algorithm get these videos out and get people, other designers in the world, learning how to design and create advanced prototypes with ProtoPie. Okay, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.